many of us have manual die cutting machines because they're super practical for all kinds of paper crafters. But what if I told you that you could be making some big mistakes when using your machine? How do I know? Because I've made them too. Hey creative friends, it's Gwen. Today I'm sharing my favorite tips and tricks for perfect die cutting every time. Let's see if you're making any of these mistakes. Mistake number one is thinking that thinner paper is easier to cut than thicker paper. The weight of the paper that you're using matters, and if you're using super thin paper, you may need to add a shim. Not sure what a shim is? It's simply an extra sheet of paper or two that goes into your stack. Just because a paper is thinner does not mean it is easier to cut. Remember, the rollers on your machine are somewhat fixed, so the pressure changes when you're using thinner paper. Different papers are constructed differently. Thinner papers tend to be smoother and they actually have a tighter fiber, making them much harder to cut. Thicker paper tends to have more loose fibers, making it easier to cut. So what can you do if your die is not cutting the paper all the way through? You need to test it on lots of different varieties of paper, especially the thicker ones. It is super rare to have a die not be able to cut through something like thick watercolor paper. If that still doesn't work, try adding a shim. It could also be that your die is actually defective, so contact the manufacturer who will have specific tips and tricks to help. Mistake number two is thinking that the order of your stack doesn't matter. I'm here to tell you that it actually does. Yes, the stack will fit through your machine in any order, but there are several really good reasons to stack it correctly. I've made the mistake of not putting my dies between the two cutting plates and have actually damaged my base plate. So be sure that your die is placed between the two cutting pads every time. It's also really important to place your die cutting side up. You wouldn't think that would make any difference at all, but I have found that the downward pressure placed on the die as it goes through the machine is greater than any upward pressure. If you place your die with the cutting side facing up, you're going to get the most out of that force. There is one more thing to mention about the specific order of your cutting plates, but I will get to that in a moment when we talk about cutting plate maintenance. Mistake number three is not cleaning out your dies after each and every use. When you're using your dies a lot, it can be quite annoying to have those leftover pieces of card stuck inside. So much so that it's tempting to ignore them and continue on using your die. This is a big no-no and will actually change how effective your die is. So be sure to clean them out fully after each and every use. There's a few ways that you can go about doing this. You can use a pokey tool to manually remove the pieces one by one. You can firmly drop the die onto a tabletop that often releases paper stuck inside, or you can use products like quick release die cut paper. They really help. Mistake number four is not maintaining your cutting plates. It's super important to take good care of the cutting plates for your machine. You'll need to flip and rotate them regularly to avoid warping. Warped plates will affect your die cutting results, and if they get too warped, they will either not fit through your machine or snap and break. Also, have you ever ended up with lines and textures on the back of your die cut pieces? The ones that have been transferred from well-used cutting plates? There's a couple of things that you can do to fix that. First of all, go back to mistake number one and make sure that your plates are stacked correctly. If you ensure that you're only ever cutting into one of your plates, you will avoid this problem altogether. So be sure to stack them so that you're only ever cutting into just one of the plates. If it's too late for that, not to worry, you can add in a couple of extra sheets of paper to act as buffers. This can help soften and reduce these marks. I have a couple of sets of plates that I mix and match for my machine with the focus to keep at least one of them free from any cuts and marks. Mistake number 5 is not securing your dies in place when cutting. If you really want to get the most out of your paper supplies, it's important to place your dies carefully and secure them. You can do this with either a magnetic plate or some repositionable tape. I prefer to use a magnetic plate because of the precision that it gives me, but washi tape is a really good option as well. If you don't lock your dies into position, you risk them moving as you complete the stack and then run it through the machine. Be sure to place them as centered as possible. The pressure of the machine is at its greatest down the center of the cutting mats. While we're talking about saving paper, mistake number 6 is not using your paper scraps to do some batch die cutting. I'm sure, like me, you have a bunch of paper scraps sitting in your stash. Don't throw them out because there's so much you can do with those, including batch die cutting. Pull out a bunch of dies, all of those paper scraps, and get cutting. From there, you can store your dies in folders and you will have a nice selection ready for your next project. Batch cutting saves a lot of time, and it's actually one of the ideas I shared in my How to Scrapbook Faster video. I'll leave a card to it here and a link below. Be sure to do this while you're creating as well. If you're making a lovely layered project, I'm sure that there's layers of paper that you can sneak a die cut out of. Mistake number 7 is thinking that your dies can only cut paper. Yes, of course, dies are fabulous for all kinds of paper, but did you know that they can also cut foam so that you can create your own stamps? I'm using inexpensive foam from my local big box store, and I am just going to pass it through the machine once to get this cut. It's super important to only pass it through one time. If it goes through twice, you will not get a clean cut. This is because the foam will move ever so slightly as it squishes through the rollers, even if you tape it down. For best results, run it through the once and it will cut nice and cleanly. If you find that you need slightly more pressure to get a clean cut, simply add a shim. To get the perfect shim, experiment with different kinds of paper, vellum, notebook paper, or printer copy paper. Chances are you do not need very thick paper to make this work. Trial and error is key. Dies can also be used to emboss. You'll need a silicone embossing mat to do this. If you're not sure where to get one, I'll leave a link in the description box below, along with all of the other supplies I've used in today's video. I'm sure you're wondering, does the die cut into the silicone mat? No, it does not. The mat converts any die into an embossing folder. This is another time that you'll want to run your die through just the once. The squishiness of the embossing mat can move, so one pass is all you need. When working with these last two techniques, be sure to adjust your plates as you go. Never force your stack through the machine. There should only ever be gentle pressure because that's all you need. Now that you know my favorite tips and tricks for the perfect die cut every time, we need to talk about die and stamp storage. How do you make sure that the pieces of your die sets stay together? How do you keep track of all of these sets and options that you have, and how can you organize them quickly and easily? I share that in this next video. It's simple, it's inexpensive, and it works no matter how many supplies you have. Be sure to watch that video next, and I'll see you all again very soon. Until then, bye!